My name is Tina Rivers-Ryan, and I am so delighted to be joined by Cecilia Alemani, the Director and Chief Curator of New York's High Line for the Summer 2025 episode of Under the Cover. Thank you so much, Cecilia, for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
We are celebrating your contribution to this issue, to our column called The Checklist, which is our monthly interview with a curator. I wanted to start with the very first question, which asks you to define what curating is. And to sort of summarize, you say that curating is the art of telling stories, and that both artworks and the spaces in which you display them evoke stories. So I was wondering if you could say more about the process of discovering those stories.
Well, I think, curating comes when, as curator, we put voices together and we are able to tell stories that go beyond what a simple artwork can tell on their own. I think of, the dialogue that exists not just between artworks, but also with the exhibition space, but also with a broader space where the exhibition takes place. For instance, I just did a large show in Santa Fe, and the city itself and its history became very much a part of my job as a curator, to keep that in mind and to include it into the exhibition. So I think those elements are completely merged, and they have to exist together in order to be able to tell different stories.
One of the questions that we ask in the checklist is about sort of the most urgent or pressing problems that the curatorial field is facing. Mm-hmm. And you very succinctly gesture towards this question of freedom of expression, mm-hmm. and freedom for artists. If you have more thoughts about that, I think we'd really love to hear them.
Mm-hmm. Look, I think we are in a very complex condition as a society, as a world. I still really, really believe that art is one of the very few spheres and places where people are allowed to speak up and share opinions. And while I recognize that there is a certain tension and friction in that voice and maybe the more institutional containers where that voice can happen, like museums and institutions, I still do believe in the power of art to speak up. And that can happen, maybe not in the most famous museums in the world, but it has to happen in places where it can be heard. And I think especially right now, art is that field that freedom is still allowed, maybe not in the usual channels, but we should cherish and support that.
And not just communicate messages, but also ask questions, right?
Sure.
That it's not simply a matter of telling people how to think or informing the public. I mean, we have op-eds in the newspapers, we have journalism, et cetera, but of getting people to sort of think differently, to reframe the question, or to connect with the facts of the world with reality on a, perhaps a more emotional or psychological way.
So I'm just going to say an example of a show that I just did in Santa Fe that I just mentioned, but I think it's pertinent. We have an artist called David Horowitz, who you probably know very well, who did a very beautiful installation in Santa Fe, and it was a reference to a very specific history of Santa Fe and the sort of Japanese internment camp that was in Santa Fe in the 1940s. And he did this very, very poetic installation, which consisted of 4,555 glass marbles scattered on the floor. And as you looked closely, they each contained a pinch of sand from the place where this encampment was in Santa Fe, which of course doesn't exist anymore. We had a very exciting conversation a few weeks ago, and we asked him, do you think this is a memorial? And he said, if a memorial is just something about things that have passed, then no, because this installation can still be very much a reflection of what's happening right now in this country at the border and with the issues of immigration. So he was able to, to comment on something that is happening right now and to open up a question like, is this something that happened already?
Given that you're somebody who has such a deep and long resume, and you brought up the fact that right now there is a kind of a kind of standardization that we're seeing with biennials and museum exhibitions around the world. And so I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that's something that I've been thinking a lot, especially as I first curated Venice, which is a much more, let's say, universal exhibition or much like more global exhibition, and then shifting gear and doing a biennial in Santa Fe, which is much smaller and much more specific. And that led me to reflect quite a bit on what brings us to go see these exhibitions all over the world, and realizing that so many of the most recent museums that have been built in the last 10 years have very similar missions and very similar display of, not necessarily trophies, but you always want to have a Louis Bourgeois outside in your terrace or a Jeff Koons, which is all great. But at the same time, I think, especially for us in the art world, and realizing that we're all very privileged that we can take a plane to go to Hong Kong and see a show, but there is nothing more frustrating to go all the way to the other side of the world and see the same show that I could see here in New York. Again, realizing that I'm fortunate because I live in one of the most important capitals for art. But I do, I kind of reflect a lot on what someone like Orhan Pamuk, the amazing Turkish writer, has written and has talked about in his Museum of Innocence, which is this incredible museum that he built, I believe in 2012 in Istanbul, in Turkey. He strongly believes that museums should actually be museums about the individuals and about storytelling and about private stories that are not this desire of capturing the universalism or the globalization of our world. That's, of course, like a job that museums like the Louvre or the Met can do, but that should not be the aspiration of the smaller or newer museums, which instead should really focus on telling the story of the people that live in those places.
Yeah, I mean, I've been spending a lot of time recently thinking about the difference between globalization and internationalism. As I've cited to numerous people, I find it very interesting that Artforum's full name is actually Artforum International. And it's a bit ironic because, of course, Artforum was part of this globalization of the art world that we saw, in the 90s and the early 21st century. But I've been thinking a lot about the difference between a kind of globalized model of art in which you have a kind of exportation of a certain way of making art and thinking about art and writing about art around the world. The difference between that and then thinking about the international as a way of building a kind of network, a conversation, a dialogue between local communities, spaces, actors, that sort of understands and respects the specificity of the people who are participating in that dialogue. I also very much love the political connotations. So.
That's very interesting because the biennial in Santa Fe is called the International, and it actually came out. It's interesting because it was born in 1995, of course, in the wake of globalization of the art world and the proliferation of so many biennials throughout the world. But now it's very much the idea that it's international in the sense that it's bringing the world to Santa Fe, but in relationship with Santa Fe. So the locale, as you just mentioned, is the key to it's the entry point to allow the international scene there. So
we're sitting here in your offices above the High Line, which I know you and I have spoken about this before. Like when I first came to New York, like this did not exist. So what's next for public art? I mean, we sort of know, like since you started here in 2011, how much more prominent it's become. It's something you always expect to see at biennials and triennials. Every museum now seems to be pursuing some type of public art program.
I think what's next is a departure from what public art has always been defined in the 60s and 70s, which is more like prop art, right? You go downtown and you see a beautiful Calder or Marc de Souver, which of course are incredible sculptures, but experiences that in my opinion, allow less of a dialogue with the audience. They just feel like they magically appear in your squares that you don't really know where they came from. I think public art since then has changed quite a bit, and I think you see it on the Highland, but you see it also in other amazing institutions like Public Art Fund and Creative Time and Art Production Fund. So a public artwork is no longer a bronze sculpture. It can be a performance, it can be a billboard, it can be a mural, it can be an event. And I think that flexibility of thinking about the concept of public art has really helped us, especially on the Highline, to allow for very different experiences.
You mentioned that there are sometimes public art projects that, for example, might be a billboard where you look at it and you're not even entirely sure like what it is or know that it's art. How do you feel about that? Like, is it important that the audience ultimately understand that that was an artistic intervention into public space, or is it sort of okay if it just...
Well, it's a very good question, because when I started working at the Highline, I had that question in mind all the time. Like, do I need to be more populistic because our audience is just, mostly people that are not necessarily familiar or don't have necessarily a background in art. We have so many millions of visitors that come from the rest of America and from the rest of the world. And so should I be easy as a curator, or should I bring something that is conceptually challenging? And I realized very soon that that was not a relevant question, because as you just sit on a bench on the Highland for 5 minutes next to an artwork, and every single person that walks by understand that's art. It doesn't matter what they understand about the piece, or if they love it, they hate it, they're upset about it, but there is that kind of moment of surprise, which is what I love about this job, because it really stimulates an encounter that often is a bit more passive in a museum. Like when you go to a museum, you pay a ticket, you know you're gonna see amazing art. And that relationship is more like a given. Here is, and around the city, I think public art has this function of a surprise effect, but that kind of encounter is what I think is really its power, because it really stimulates an engagement.
Obviously, you read criticism, and in the checklist we asked you about a piece of criticism that has influenced you or stuck with you, and you mention Peter Schjeldahl's 2011 review of William de Kooning's exhibition at MoMA, because of course you curated a William de Kooning show at Gagosian this spring, and you specifically cite one line where he says, "If you cherish the ox of any aesthetic or ideological bias, he'll gore it." And thank you so much for just reminding us of Peter's poetry and his writing.
Yeah.
I know we all miss it very much.
Well, I think it's an incredibly important part of what we do. Of course, as curators, we also write very often. I don't think of myself necessarily as a critic in that sense. I think there are excellent voices out there that can do a much better job. So I was very moved when I reread that review in the New Yorker of Peter Schjeldahl, because of course I miss him very much. And it was, the freedom of saying words like that, I really miss it. At the same time, I think it's an incredibly important part of our job and our world. And I think what you guys do with the magazine and many other colleagues is so relevant, especially now as communication and art writing is becoming so diluted in social media and with AI. I still truly believe in the power of writing and handwriting, meaning like coming from your own mind. And I really appreciate reading a great piece of criticism, but I also recognize that there is a struggle out there that we kind of have to solve all together.
You are one of the most sort of celebrated curators of our time. Your Venice Biennale, The Milk of Dreams, was such a landmark exhibition, I think. Obviously the first Biennale to really focus on women and gender nonconforming artists. Advice to younger curators?
I'd say be curious, learn a lot. Don't necessarily, of course, we all need a job, and that, unfortunately, that field is complicated because also there are many more young curators than there used to be 20 years ago when I started. But be curious, go see as many shows as you can. And the shows don't have to be necessarily at the Museum of Modern Art. They can literally be in your local gallery. They can be in where you're coming from. It doesn't matter. Like, just train your eye in understanding what's good and what's bad, or whatever the largest field that is in between these two extremes. I also recommend always to do studio visit. Just go visit your local artists. Learn how you do a studio visit. Practice your questions. And try to interrogate what an artwork does. It doesn't matter where. And then I think it's very important also to train your own writing. And it doesn't have to be that you write for a famous magazine, but it can literally be you just write for yourself, a review, like just exercise your critical eye in doing a review for a good show and do the same show from a bad perspective. So just really try to be, to understand the multiple facets of this job, which is, again, not just putting works together, but is writing, is interrogating the artworks. And then I think, it's one of the most rewarding parts of my job is when I get a random email on my website of a curator that says, your show was very influential for me, can I just meet you and talk to you for 5 minutes? So don't be shy, just ask mentorships, and it doesn't have to be a formal mentorship, but just ask a curator that you love to sit with them for 5 minutes or for 30 minutes and learn how they got there.